Yeah. I'm in the student center team.
Okay. Harold, do you have a way to speak with Eugene and make sure that he's on his way here?
Yeah, let me check his cell phone. 1 second.
Thank you. Appreciate your patience here. Harold, did you reach Eugene?
I did. He said he's logging on now.
Okay, so he'll be with us in a moment then. Folks, we are live on YouTube now. And as you can see, we're going to have our presenters going to be on with us by Zoom. And this also will be available on YouTube afterwards. But why don't we go ahead and I'll get started with an opening prayer and then introduce Harold. And by the time I do that, maybe Eugene will be online here, Eugene Bradley. So please pray with me. Lord, grant us wisdom and courage to be ashamed of that which is shameful in our history. We know that we cannot make amends, and we know that we can and must do better. In Jesus' name, amen. In the 1930s, a fire destroyed a small wooden schoolhouse in West Davidson. Ada Jenkins was a teacher at that schoolhouse, and she raised the funds to build what became the Davidson Colored School. Mrs. Jenkins died in 1955, and the school was named for her. The school closed in 1966 when the schools were integrated. After that, the building was used as a community center. In 1994, the Ada Jenkins Families and Careers Development Center was formed as a 501c3 nonprofit. Since that time, the Ada Jenkins Center has grown to be the premier provider of social services in North Meck. I served on the board of the Ada Jenkins Center for 5 years, including 2 years as co-chair. I am continuing now on a committee that, among other things, is asking the questions, have we underserved the Black community? Have we weakened our connection with the community that birthed us? Harold Rice became the CEO of the Ada Jenkins Center in the early days of the pandemic after a thorough, highly professional national search. Mr. Rice has a bachelor's degree in social work from the University of North Carolina at Pembroke and an MBA from Pfeiffer University in Charlotte. From 2007 until 2020, Mr. Rice worked for the Community Link programs of Travelers Aid Society in Charlotte, first as Director of Housing Programs, and then as Vice President and Chief Operating Officer. The Ada Jenkins Center has played a critical role in applying federal and state resources to address the pandemic's effects on marginalized communities, and is widely recognized by governments, by foundations, and throughout the local nonprofit community for its solid and visionary leadership. So please welcome to the Covenant class, my friend Harold Rice.
Thank you, Jesse, for the introduction, and look forward to meeting all of you. Hopefully, within one of these series, I can definitely be there in person, hopefully, and looking forward to that. The Ada Jenkins Center, as Jesse so eloquently said, we are a part of awareness as well. The communities in which we serve, while we do have programs, awareness and advocacy is really, really near and dear to us. Hence what Miss Ada Jenkins put forth as the School for the Colored. So we will continue these conversations. Today is not about me. I want to introduce you to the guest speaker, Mr. Eugene Bradley. And both Eugene and I both came along during the pandemic, so we share a lot as it relates to taking on a role and learning our team members virtually. So Eugene and I have shared a lot of conversations. Eugene Bradley was hired by the town of Davidson as the town's first housing and equity director. In this key position, Eugene is leading the town's affordable housing and racial equity programs. This role is responsible for developing and implementing affordable housing strategies, as well as racial equity action plans. Eugene has served in this role since October 26, 2020. He was also the Aviation Department's Community Affairs Manager, who was responsible for increasing Charlotte airport presence and partnerships with the surrounding businesses, neighborhoods, and community organizations. He also collaborated with the Charlotte airport partners and tenants to provide resources to local community. Eugene worked as the Southwest Community Engagement Manager for the City of Charlotte Housing and Neighborhood Services Development, which provides housing, 311, code enforcement, and community engagement services for the City of Charlotte in the Southwest service area. Eugene's main responsibilities with the Housing and Neighborhood Services includes developing service area work plans, community engagement tools, problem solving, and implementation of neighborhood revitalization initiatives. Eugene has over 17 years public sector planning and implementation experience in the fields of neighborhood revitalization, community development, placemaking, and land use planning. He began his career with the City of Rochester, New York, assisting community capacity building, community engagement, and waterfront development, and later working as a planner for the City of Norfolk, Virginia, developing and implementing neighborhood plans. Since 2008, Eugene has worked with the City of Charlotte, 12 years with the Charlotte Department of Housing and Neighborhood Services as a community engagement manager with a focus on community engagement, housing, and plan implementation. I want to present to you all Eugene Bradley for a wonderful conversation around how housing impacts racial equities or inequities in our communities. So I'll pass it over to Eugene.
Harold, thank you for that intro. Good morning, everyone. I apologize for being a little bit late. I had it on my calendar for 10 o'clock, but Harold was able, gracious enough to give me a call and say, hey, we're all right now. So again, thank you for allowing me to come and speak to you. This topic of housing and equity and racial inequality is something that's kind of near and dear to my heart. It's kind of at the core of kind of who I am, how I was raised, and bring a lot of personal, but also kind of just a knowledge base from my career into this field. And so this is something that I've been very excited to be able to work on for the town of Davidson and really start to hopefully be able to lay a good foundation of how we move forward. And so a little bit about me. I'm originally from Rochester, New York, went to school in Buffalo. There I got my undergrad degree in communication and informatics, and my graduate degree is in urban planning. So I am an urban planner at heart. And so I'm always a big advocate for urban planning. It allows for perspective. And I think that's really important when we talk about housing, for honestly everything that we do in today's society, of really being able to have a perspective and be able to zoom out from where you are and look at the big picture and how that plays out for everyone. And so for the sake of today, we will be kind of zeroing in on housing, how that impacts communities of color specifically. And so I'll really kind of start to talk about kind of in general what the country have seen, what Charlotte had seen, and then get down to specifically Davidson and some of the things that had transpired, may have a negative impact on the community specifically, and then really talk about how we move forward, or what things that have been done in order to kind of bridge the gap or kind of restore justice. I'm a big believer in restorative justice. I think a lot of people can identify with that because everyone wants justice when they have been wronged or done harm to. It's a part of our system of government is to have justice. And so when we put things in that perspective, how do we restore justice for a community that has been harmed over decades and actually hundreds of years in certain cases? And so with that, I will kind of start with my presentation. So I will share my screen if you bear with me. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
All right. And so wanted to start kind of really talking about the racial wealth gap. I think depending on how where you are with this, there's just been a lot of discussion around kind of the wealth gap and kind of really what that means for the average person in the US today. And so really looking at kind of that is primarily the primary avenue for folks to actually build wealth in this country. Really coming out of the Great Depression, there were several kind of policies passed with the New Deal and really trying to establish essentially the middle class in this country. And so since that point, there have been several policies that really have impacted all Americans, but particularly the community of color, for Black and Latinos, in a very specific way by not having access. And so if you look at kind of the chart, this kind of gives you, this data is from back in 2016. The gap has only widened since that point. So it gives you a kind of an idea when you talk about medium value home equity. It kind of tells the story of kind of how neighborhoods play out and have played out over decades, quite honestly. And so when we talk about equity, it really talks about where the home is and how that impacts a neighborhood. And so if you ever kind of go through some of what you may consider a disinvested neighborhood, you will see a lot of the similarities no matter where you go in this country. You typically see train tracks somewhere. Norfolk Southern has a lot to do with that. It's the effects of how you divide communities. And so that Davidson is no different. That has been a point of division in this country that we don't really talk about a whole lot. Really, when you break up neighborhoods by those types of transportation modes, if you will, we'll talk a little bit about urban renewal and a little bit of how you use infrastructure to divide communities. But you do see some of the similar kind of things in each of these neighborhoods, no matter where you go in this country. I've been fortunate enough to work in several different cities throughout my career, and it's pretty much all the same. And so some of the worst neighborhoods are located near train tracks, but you do see the lack of or the disinvestments in those neighborhoods over time. We'll start talking about redlining and how that impacts neighborhoods. When redlining has allowed whole neighborhoods to be designated as undesirable and not allowed to have financing investments, they shut out really, honestly, a lot of communities of color to build wealth. And we'll kind of take a look at kind of the history of what that has been for and how it's impacted communities of color. And so in 1930, the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation mapped out urban neighborhoods according to perceived credit risk. And so this was what established of kind of credit in the early 1930s. and really started to lay the map of, honestly, the new version of segregation, and how you deem a neighborhood high risk, acceptable, transitioning. When you see some of those terms, you really get an idea of how maps were essentially drawn and people were literally mapped out of wealth, quite honestly. And believe it or not, most people don't realize really since the end of slavery up into like the 1930s, everyone, when I say everyone, everyone within America, that doesn't matter what shade or color, was actually living together for a very long time. And so when you look back and you look at records, and you look at old maps, and Charlotte does a really good job of kind of telling its history within Charlotte, but it's no different than any other country. And if you do a little bit of digging within your family history, I've been able to do that personally. And you do find out, late 1800s, early 1900s, Black and white folks were living together, including Hispanics. And so what happened? The question is, what happened since that time to the 1930s? Well, obviously you have the Great Depression that happened. And then one of the big shifts in our country when you really start to see segregation really take off is when you started to see the issue of redlining. And so when you start parceling out whole neighborhoods, and allowing certain segments of our community to have access to better neighborhoods, and leverage investments in these neighborhoods, you really start to lay a solid foundation of segregation from a wealth standpoint. And so this is kind of a map of Charlotte in particular. And so if anyone's familiar with the city of Charlotte, and you look at kind of the downtown area / uptown area, you can start to see kind of where segments of communities were kind of isolated and disinvested in for a number of years. A lot has happened since that point to this time. And so we've working in the city of Charlotte for so long, there's a thing that we call the Wedge, and it's really kind of that southwest to southeast kind of quarter of the city that is really where all the concentration of wealth has been historically. That's changed a little bit just from kind of where we are today, but the areas around that were primarily transitioning or at high risk. And so those have been some of the toughest neighborhoods to work in. A lot of my career working with the city of Charlotte has been in some of those neighborhoods. So I know it firsthand. So there's a lot of things that kind of build on top of this. And so when we talk about disparities, it has a link to lack of sufficient income, less access to intergenerational wealth, payments, discrimination, lending practices, all have contributed to this segregation when it comes to wealth in particular. Other impacts that have kind of really impacted our community from an urban setting, and this kind of generally bleeds out to our communities that are a little bit further away from our city core center. So 1949, the federal government started to allocate funds to purchase and demolish quote unquote slum housing. This is really the first thing we see called urban renewal. Not sure if folks are familiar with that term, but this really allowed for across this country a lot of infrastructure projects to take place. And where those infrastructure projects take place were in urban neighborhoods. And so in order to kind of move the country forward from an infrastructure standpoint, when you look at the 1940s and 50s, you really start to see the production of cars, mass housing. So your split level ranches, your ranch style house started to be built in mass quantities. And now you see the birth of suburbs starting at this point. And so when that happens, there was a need for infrastructure to connect people to those outer regions of the city core. And so at the expense of a lot of minority neighborhoods, infrastructure were placed right smack dab in the middle of those neighborhoods. And Charlotte's no different. We have our own story. If folks have been in Charlotte for a while, you might be familiar with the neighborhood called Brooklyn, which was really what we call right now Second Ward in the city of Charlotte. And urban renewal really essentially decimated that neighborhood where it's not a neighborhood anymore. This is where, if you guys are familiar with Uptown, where the government building is, Old City Hall, the government center, where the courthouse is, Martin Luther King Park, those sections, the aquatic center, that section of the city was all considered Brooklyn at one point in time. And when urban renewal came in and put the 277 loop in, as well as the 77, it essentially took out, it allowed government and local government to buy up large parcels of tracts of land in order to install infrastructure, the highway system as we know it today. And so that allowed a lot of displacement for a lot of communities, and particularly with Brooklyn, you really start to see really, it was a really core piece for the African-American community at the time, where you had over 100 businesses that went out of business literally overnight. So you don't have the opportunity to actually even continue to build wealth from those avenues. And so you have a series of things that have negatively impacted the African community in this area. And so now when you have that happen, you have neighborhoods and folks starting to spread out and get displaced. So Bennett Ford was another large area where a lot of folks relocated. And so this is probably one of the last places that you still have a concentration of Black businesses. So if you go along that Bennett Ford corridor, this is kind of the migration of those businesses that were lost or their land taken away during urban renewal and kind of relocated there. And so this kind of gives you an idea of how policy and government policies have affected specifically African Americans. And so when you have coupled that with redlining, urban renewal, and several other things that have happened on the federal level, but also local level, it's really caused that gap to continue to further separate folks. And so when we talk about policies, there's been some out of civil rights, there are obviously some great things that happen out of that as far as discrimination. Honestly, a lot of what Martin Luther King was discussing right prior to his death was talking about economic equality. And so really speaking to those things I just spoke about from urban renewal and how that's caused the beginning of a wealth gap, a large wealth gap there, and how do you, really even up the playing field, or at least guarantee that the same opportunities. And so in 1977, Congress passed the Community Reinvestment Act, was sought to end discrimination in lending practices. So really this is the answer or attempt to answer redlining since that point. And so keep in mind, redlining started in the 1930s. And so this law passes in 1977. So you almost got 30 years plus of really bad policies and practices. And so as our country grows, you start to see that gap continue to further widen. And so even since that point to today, there's only been a handful of lawsuits that the Department of Justice has really gone to bat to combat that. And so while there's laws, the practice still persists today of how kind of the market is dictated of who can live where. While it's illegal, there are still housing discrimination that happens on today. We do have, as far as Mecklenburg County is concerned, we do have a community relation community that actually deals with that on a daily basis, where folks are not given the same opportunities to live where they choose to, giving all things being equal. If you have the same credit score, if you have the same income, Black people and as well as Latinos are still disproportionately isolated out of some of those situations. And so there's still a lot of work to happen there. And so these are things that other policies have also contribute to the separation of income and the wealth gap. And so talking a little bit about Davidson, Davidson has been a very interesting place, and I've grown to actually love this place very much. The folks here are just the salt of the earth, which I do appreciate. I've been quite honestly enjoyed my time here in working with community members and leaders in this community. And so talking about other things more specific to Davidson, kind of what has had some negative impacts on the African community from a housing standpoint. One of the bullets that's not on here, and I'll kind of just generally speak to it, is the issue of the asbestos and the whole kind of unfolding of that story, where asbestos are actually stored as fill in people's yards and around their houses, particularly in West Davidson. and how long that persisted for many years, and now more recently in the last 5 years started to be addressed. So you've had decades of environmental injustice there, and that does have an impact on housing values and those types of things. And so, in addition to that, Davidson College has had its impact on particularly West Davidson and starting to acquire properties on Griffin Street in particular, really starting in 1963 all the way up to the mid 90s. There's been a kind of a slow in that period acquisitions of properties along that front. And really that's kind of, for folks that do come to Davidson by the 77, that's really the front door to town, but also to the college. And so by taking properties that were deemed not in good shape and acquiring those properties, and there's a lot of dynamics that happen of how that happened, and so depending on who you talk to, there's a little bit of different perspective there. But when that happens and nothing's replaced there, you have an impact on communities, in particular with folks in West Davidson, where there's lost opportunities from a housing standpoint and a wealth generation there. If you were to sell those properties back right now, you're talking multi-million-dollar worth of equity that's there. There's just nothing on it right now, just because of where it is. And so if you imagine all of that wealth was essentially lost at a certain point in time, most of those properties were acquired during the 90s, the mid 90s, 94, 95. And so that had a huge impact on this community in particular. One of the things that also had a positive impact on this community is really in 2001, we actually had a committee in the town actually advocate for inclusionary zoning. And for those that may not be familiar with that, is we're one of 3 municipalities in the entire state that actually has inclusionary zoning, in which basically for any residential development, it guarantees 12.5% that will be affordable housing. And so for understanding kind of the wealth gap separation, there are more folks that need affordable housing. And quite honestly, across our county, but in particular in Davidson. And Davidson is one of the kind of higher income neighborhoods within Mecklenburg County. So inclusionary zoning has allowed for units to be built on the ground specifically to address that, a part of that. And so I think that's something that's been a really positive thing since its inception. We've approximately got about 90 units that have been built because of this zoning. And so you have a decent amount of affordable housing. Well, it depends on kind of how you define decent, but we do have it here. A lot of folks come and don't realize that we have affordable housing. But altogether, we have about 262 units on the ground. Our hope is to increase that in the work that we'll be embarking on over the coming months. And so that's had a real impact on this community in a positive way. And so one of the things that have impacted not just this community, but across the country, across the county, and particularly in the city, is impacted me personally, where I live, is the issue of gentrification. And I think they can, a lot of times when you hear that, it's a negative word. And so essentially what's happened with gentrification is like disinvestment in neighborhoods over decades have lower property values in some of those areas, as kind of the new American dream has been established to live near the urban core. The places that were essentially deemed not desirable are now desirable because you're closer to resources. So you look at properties near town or near uptown in the downtown area, those are the most expensive properties that you have in this region, just because people want to be close to resources where they can go to a restaurant, they can go to the laundromat within a reasonable either walking distance or driving distance. So because of that dynamic, you've had neighborhoods that surround those core town centers, if you will, that have started to increase in property values as folks move closer in. Those investments from the private sector have essentially started to push folks out of their neighborhoods. And that's kind of what you've seen in West Davidson. in particular, where you've over the last, honestly, 20 years or so, you've seen the increased population growth of Davidson. And part of that is gentrification has this niche within that. And so that's kind of what you've seen in West Davidson, but also community I have moved to personally, it's literally happening in my neighborhood as I speak. And so there's a lot of dynamics that go into that. Race plays an issue in that. Class plays an issue into that, of the dynamics between folks that live in those neighborhoods. Historically, if you have disinvestment in neighborhoods for decades, you have a concentration of poverty in those neighborhoods. And we do understand that folks that have been historically in poverty have a certain set of circumstances and a way of kind of navigating life that's different than folks kind of in that middle class section, and which is different than the folks or that maybe in the upper class section. And so when folks start to move back into these places, the dynamics and priorities start to shift, and it causes a lot of internal issues. And so that has been really something that's been plaguing kind of our country across the board. And so we're really trying to, how do we kind of unpack that as our community, and how do we encourage affordable housing in those areas so folks can continue to live in areas that are close to resources, in places that they desire, without being kind of priced out of their neighborhoods. And so you start to see that effect within gentrification, in not only in our county, but particularly in Davidson and West Davidson specifically. And so one of the things that we're currently embarking on is our affordable housing plan. And so we currently have hired consultants to work with us on how do we establish goals for affordable housing, kind of really defining what it means, who it's for. And so I think there's a lot of misconception depending on where you come from. We have a lot of transplants from the north and living in Davidson now that think very differently when they hear the term affordable housing, depending on if you're coming from, say, New York or Pittsburgh or even Rochester. When you talk about affordable housing, people think subsidized housing, they think the projects and every negative thing that you've seen on TV associate with those type of properties. And so what have done in Davidson is very different. It is not that. I like to tell people this is not your grandparents' affordable housing. It is not that. This is something that you would absolutely want to live in, anyone across the board. And so that's something that it's really since the 2000s, Davidson actually had a really good legacy of doing high quality affordable housing. Well, you don't know it's affordable housing, and that's kind of the key. So you allow people to have dignity in the neighborhoods they choose to live in. And so part of our plan is really talking about how do we start to build on that legacy? How do we increase our unit count when it comes to affordable housing? How do we really start to restore justice for a community that has been negatively impacted there, particularly in West Davidson? And so I think we're getting to that point. We actually have a survey coming out tomorrow, affordable housing survey that everyone will have access to. This is really allowing us to gain information from not only this community, but folks that want to live in Davidson. We about 90 or upper 80s to 90% of folks that work here don't live here. We feel that's a problem. It's a problem for our environment when you talk about sustainability. As far as access to resources, it can be an issue. And so we desire for folks that work here have the opportunity to live here. It's better for everyone, quite honestly, when that dynamic happens. And so a part of this plan is really be able to, as well as the survey, to gain that information for folks that want to be here. And then how do we start to roll out a plan based off of this information and knowledge based in a respectful and critical way to allow folks to have access to places and spaces within Davidson that they desire. And so that is something that I'm excited about working on. Again, if you're a part of most networks in Davidson, you'll start to see some information come out on our survey. I encourage folks to go to our website because it will be available there. So we do encourage folks to take that because it will allow us to, the first step in engaging our community from an affordable housing standpoint. We do plan on having several public meetings, focus groups with folks in and around town, the development community and understanding kind of what it takes to make the deal work, if you will, but also from non-for-profit providers, how they work in the affordable housing space and how that connects to social issues. And so we are really excited to kind of get this going and moving forward with it. Our hope is to wrap this plan up by the end of March, April timeframe, God willing. And then we'll be able to really have a play sheet of how we need to move forward, what goals we want to be able to set and move towards. And so it will allow us to really start the opportunity for one, restore justice, but also provide housing for folks that normally would have had access to it. When we talk about affordable housing, there's a huge range there. I myself will qualify for affordable housing, 100% of the median income, given my household size. And so folks, a lot of times folks don't realize they qualify. And so we want to be able to tell that story in a real way where it connects to the community and really allow folks to think differently and think bigger about what this means for our community. So I'm excited to be able to work on that. But with that, I have if there's questions out there, I'm happy to answer them. I'm pretty available throughout the week. So if folks have questions or want to reach out to me directly, I am more than happy to talk. I love this stuff. This is kind of the core of who I am. And so, again, I do appreciate opportunities to speak with you guys this morning, but I'll open up for questions if that's kind of the format. So I'll go from there. But thank you, guys.
Thank you, Eugene. Questions?
Eugene, Steve Justice. But the affordable housing plan consultant, will they also, I know you know gentrification, what about Reinvestment? I don't know if that's a term, but there's pressure in terms of the African American population in our town going down. And not all of others that are financial address that. And then they're backlash to our current world and culture around solutions to do it to address it. Is that going to be tackled by this consultant in any specific way?
If can I have someone repeat the question, because it's very blurry, so it's very hard to understand on my end or what the question was. Is there?
I'm sorry, it's long.
I think it's the distance from where I'm at that I can't. It's very blurry, so I can't really make out the words. If someone wants to get a little bit closer to ask the question, I can answer it that way.
Right here. Have a seat.
All right, there you go.
Is this better?
Oh, yes. All right, great. Yes, thank you.
The pressure in our town for the diminishing percentage of our population that's Black. So call that whiteification, if you will, as opposed to gentrification. Will the affordable housing plan consultant deal with that problem with any solutions? And how will they do that in the face of sort of the cultural backlash right now around solutions that are aimed at that problem?
So that's a really good question. And so how generally it's really kind of legally what you can do. You can't specifically designate housing for a specific minority group or any group for that matter. So you have to look at what tools you have available to get to those folks in an indirect way. And so if we're talking about, if we already know kind of that the wealth gap that's there and the percentage of African Americans or even Latino folks that fall within that, how do you start to develop policies or income levels that qualify for housing? So I think we start there of how you get to that point. But also, it really does take a community to tell folks about the opportunity. One thing I've learned even before I got here to Davidson is that even with the open market, most things don't go on the market here because it's word of mouth. Of when someone's about to sell a home, it's a neighbor saying, "Hey, I'm about to sell my home," and then, "Oh, wait, Johnny down the street is looking for his cousin's looking for an opportunity to move to Davidson," and then the deals are done that way. And so that already happens in this community quite a bit. So if you pull up any type of search of available housing that's on the market, it's not many because of that dynamic. And so really taking that same format or really helping folks network when opportunities do come up, when there's housing available from an affordable standpoint. How do we help folks understand where to apply, how to apply, and how they put their best foot forward in order to attain that type of housing once it's available. And so there's a lot of work that we're doing kind of on the back end right now to really look at our policies and how we encourage folks to access certain things, and really how you market things is important as well. So I think it's several different things, but word of mouth and really helping our current communities really being the mouthpiece when opportunities come up. And so I think we, as a town, we have opportunity to really make things aware, folks aware of opportunities, and really helping other folks connect to those opportunities. But great question. Are there others?
Don't be shy.
This is John Woods. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hey, how you doing, sir?
I'm good. Hey, I wanted, thank you for, someone sent me a connection to this, and I'm very happy to be involved and listen to your comments. I wanted to just say to everyone, this is not really a question, more of a comment, that Eugene's addition to the town is a great addition, and has been sort of a natural progression of our commitment to affordability and equity over many, many years. This is a really complicated matter, as you all know, because of the economics of supply and demand. And we've become such a popular place for various reasons that we have such a limited supply of housing product available. Hand in hand with this issue becomes the issue of jobs, and good paying progressive type of jobs where people can create careers, not just service jobs and menial jobs. And so the whole issue is all part and parcel of the same thing, if you will. And the good news is a lot of people have long been very focused on this, and we have organizations that are working hand in hand, and the town is very obviously involved in Eugene's activities, and the survey that'll be developed will be very helpful to guide us and to allow us to figure out how best to fight this kind of never-ending wave of economics that we face. So Eugene, best of everything, and I look forward to working with you, as well as do many others.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
Also, a reminder for anybody on Zoom, just chime in, please, if you have a question. Your voice is coming through really clearly.
Could you hear that on Zoom when she was making that announcement? She was encouraging everybody on Zoom to ask questions. That part of it is working well. This microphone that we have, the handheld microphone, is supposed to be able to let the folks on Zoom hear the people in here, but it seems not to be working too well, because you couldn't hear Steve's question until he came to the laptop here. But if who else in here or on Zoom has any other questions for Eugene?
I want to ask a question about.
Why don't you come over here, Pam, to make sure that he can hear.
I'd like to ask a question about gentrification.
Yes.
That's a complicated issue. How do you respond to individuals who say, I have the right to sell my home for what I want to sell it for? How do we deal with that where people are treated fairly?
So it's a great question. Honestly, it's one of my favorite topics to talk about, because I've lived pretty much my whole time in the Charlotte area in gentrification and seeing the dynamics play out. And so, to your point, it is true. We do live in a free country. We live in a capitalist society. And so folks have the ability to sell their properties for whatever they want to. And so I think that is something that is important for folks to understand. but also there are other factors in this as well. And so for folks to understand legacy in neighborhoods and what they believe they want to leave behind for their heirs. So typically what happens, and I can kind of give you just a synopsis of what happens with gentrification on a regular basis. You have typically a generation that has bought over, 30, 40, 50 years ago in the neighborhood, have lived up their lives, raised kids. Those kids leave. They go to other places that maybe not be where they originally started from, and the person ages out. And that aging out, they leave their properties to the heirs, and the heirs typically don't want to come back and or want anything to do with the property. And so you do have a segment of the private market that kind of really looks for these opportunities. I mean, I've known folks to just essentially search obituaries and seeing where people pass and look up their address and then start sending letters to their heirs because they know the property is going to transfer to them, and offering folks basically pennies on the dollar for the property. And so that's happened quite a bit. And so the heirs get it because they don't want to be a landlord or know how to be a landlord. They're still dealing with grief from a passing of a loved one. Someone comes along, offers them more money than they probably own at that point, and that's good enough for them, and then they move on. What they don't realize is the equity in which their parents' property has is there's a delta of what they actually get versus what the person bought it for. And so a lot of times what you see is folks buy low and then sell high. And that's kind of what you've seen over the years, and not just in Davidson, but all over the country, particularly as the urban core starts to become popularized and folks are moving back to urban centers and town centers. And so that dynamic happens quite a bit. And so what you have to do is be able to educate people that are currently in those homes of really having an honest conversation of how they want to age out. What is the plan for their property? How do you educate their heirs to either be a great landlord and or make the best decision from a financial standpoint when the property is in their hands? And so I think it's several steps in that to really educate people on what it is and what it's not. I hear a lot of folks, the government's doing this and that and the third. It's the free market that's really kind of leading this way, quite honestly, because people want to be closer to resources. People want to be close to town. People want to be close to downtown because that's where all the great food is. That's where all the restaurants are, and the grocery stores and all the things that you enjoy are part of your everyday living. And so there's a demand for that. And so the thing we want to be able to do is educate people, not only the folks that are in their homes now, but also that next level of heirs that will acquire the property after that. So they know, for one, if they decide to sell their home, they're getting market value for it. And so now that's be able to create enough wealth for them to do something with. But also, if not, how do you continue to talk about affordable housing, or how, if you were to move back to the neighborhood, what it's going to take to renovate the house so your family can then go up there. And so there's a lot of opportunities there that we just don't, folks just don't know about. And so my hope is that we'll be able to have that honest conversation with a lot of our community members and really start to get them to think differently about it. There's some of that work has already started even prior for me to coming here. And so there's some groundwork that has already been laid. And so we just want to build on that moving forward.
Thank you. Thank you.
Frank, I see you have a hand up there online. I think if you just unmute yourself, you can ask your question.
Yes. Thank you. And I should fix this because Frank is my work name, which says a lot about an experience of minority. So,
Indeed.
Mr. Eugene, thank you so much for taking the time and the energy to present here. This is something that I personally care a lot about, and I hope to speak with you more and work with you on this topic. One thing that and as a follow-up to the question that was just asked about gentrification and free market sale of properties, there seems to be this solution that seems to not be discussed as much, and love your comments on this. So especially some ethnic and minority communities of non-color, so white ethnic communities in New York and Chicago, there is a trend that has existed for over 100 years where families and communities don't sell their property, they lease their property for 100-year leases. So there are luxury townhomes and apartments that are built in, say, New York, that sit on 100-year leases. The families that own those land have never been disassociated from their legacy, don't have to be very sort of educated landlords, and get this stream of income. And it's remarkable to me that this sort of knowledge is not more widespread in the African American and other kinds of minority communities. So for example, in Davidson, a house can be bought under the guise of blight or whatever it may be. And then, a $1 million home can be built on top of that land, whereas that same property could just have been leased. The same transaction could have occurred, but the land would not have been disassociated from its legacy. So would love to hear your comments on that. Thank you.
Yes. So I absolutely love that comment. It is dead on. That is something that, honestly, I'm literally talking about that very issue to my neighbor across the street from me because, again, gentrification is happening in front of me, literally in front of me. And so that is an excellent point, and that's something that that really be able to help educate people on that. And so a lot of times, what happens is people will just take the quick money and then move on. And so what they miss is opportunities. There are way more opportunities in those situations, to your point, to partner with the developer, to redevelop their property and then have a partnership where they're leasing and or building something that's comparable to them. And so a very simple situation of my neighbor that lives across the street, gentrification, she's getting calls from We Buy Houses, those types of organizations, the signs you see all over the place. They call her on a regular basis and wanting to offer her less than her property, her market rate value. And I'm like, listen, if you want to stay here, I don't encourage you necessarily to just shun them, but say, what are you going to do for me in this? How do I benefit and how do they benefit? You have to start looking in what's the win-win for everyone. And so I'm like, if you're able to build a duplex here, you know that you're aging out, how do you start to have an opportunity to work with the developer to say, hey, listen, I have the land at the hard asset. You actually have the skill set to actually build a duplex here. How do I then partner with you to benefit myself? So if it's a matter of, hey, I can live on one side and then I can rent out the other side and we both can benefit from the transaction and or sell, it allows the builder to make money as well as the person to retain ownership of the property as well. And so that's just a simple example of how you can think differently about your property and how you maximize the equity that's there versus selling it for pennies on the dollar and letting the next guy or the new person make all of the money or essentially acquire all the equity in that. And so to your point, leasing is a very viable option for a lot of our community members and really be able to help train them to understand what are your options. And my hope is that that's something we can do for this community to really help them understand, hey, it may not make sense to sell that property because you can easily partner with someone to maximize your equity there and your stake and your legacy in that neighborhood. So it's a great question. I absolutely love that folks are starting to have that conversation. That's something that I believe that we want to continue to have and really bring that up to light. So it's a win-win for everyone, not just the person that bought for cheap.
And Eugene, I'll add to that. Another example of that would be in the West Charlotte or West Side community where they come together as a land trust and purchase properties as a land trust and have first right of refusal basically within that community. And so perhaps West Davidson community forms its own 501c3 to come together, especially where there are individuals that are aging out. They don't have any heirs. So that property, that legacy can stay within the community. So again, I think it's all in all education that has to take place within communities of color around the options.
Harold, I would just add to that, a very good point. We have a land trust here in Davidson that is modeled immediately after the program that Davidson College operates for its own properties for its staff and faculty. We currently, that land trust is managed by the Davidson Housing Coalition, and it now has 11 or 12 residential structures in it that are permanently affordable and owned. The occupant owns the structure, and they lease the land for $1 a year. That land that retains the land trust retains the affordability of that property, yet also provides home ownership and the ability to create some wealth value for that comes with home ownership. So I hope we can build on that as well.
May I ask a question?
Please.
This is John Kirkendall. I would appreciate it if you'd speak to what role property taxation plays in this whole equation.
As far as gentrification, is that more specific?
Yes, as far as continued ownership on the part of the original owners or their heirs.
Yeah. And so typically when it comes to taxes, and this is kind of what we have seen, the impacts of taxes on gentrification, we haven't really seen the full weight of that at this point. I think a lot of people think that's naturally happening. As property values goes up, typically your tax bill goes up. If folks are on a fixed income, if Ms. Johnson has been there for 50 years, she's primarily collecting Social Security. That Social Security check is the same every month. And if taxes go up on her, that cost now goes up. And the thought is that she's being taxed out of her house. Well, the data shows that that's not happening at this point as of yet. And it's typically how our particularly in Mecklenburg County, the last reassessment, it was more of a tax neutral situation. So folks they may have paid a little bit, but not enough to have to move because they're being taxed out. And so I do think there's some data that needs to be kind of studied there, or at least publicized, because I think people naturally think, oh, I'm being taxed out of my house. The data just doesn't show that at this point. However, there are programs at the state level and local level that do provide tax relief for folks that fit within a certain demographic. For veterans, if you're a certain age, if you're handicapped, there are some programs like the homestead program that allows your taxes to be essentially cut in half. So you're not in that predicament moving forward as long as you're in that property. And so there are some opportunities there to make sure folks will never get to the point of where they have to make decisions because taxes have gone up, that now they have to move. And so there are some programs currently in place for that, but people haven't pulled the full weight of that, particularly in Mecklenburg County as of yet. Not to say that they may not. We'll see what this next assessment looks like and kind of how things are done from a political standpoint of what the tax rate will be and all those things. But your tax bill may have gone up $100, or even in certain cases they've gone down, depending on kind of where you are. So we still need to kind of keep an eye on that, and then also provide resources, local resources, for folks to have opportunities to not be taxed out of their home or add an additional burden to their bottom line.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yusufer, for being with us today. You have answered our questions. You have helped us understand the complexity and the importance of affordable housing. And you're working in a community where this really makes a difference. You're people who really care about this issue. So thank you for being here in Davidson with us.
Yes,
Thank you so much for having me. Love to talk with you individually or even as a group moving forward. Again, thank you for the opportunity, and I hope you have a blessed rest of the day.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eugene.
Thank you, folks.
Harold, thank you. You want to say a word about the programs coming up before we leave?
Sure, yes. Next Sunday, we will have Mr. Willie Jones from Smithfield community. And there's a lot of interesting things happening around Smithfield, around that conversation. And so he is going to grace us with his presence next Sunday. And he's excited about it. So please come back. They have a housing issue. It's different, but it also has some inequities. And so love for you guys to be a part of this conversation. So see you guys next Sunday.
Okay, great. Thank you, Harold. And thank you,
Thanks, sir.
Jane. Thanks all of you.